India. This is actually medieval. We've already been to India once. All right, your book starts off talking about Indian styles. India is a hot place, folks, a hot climate. And to keep themselves cool, the people of India dressed in very loose-fitting clothing. Now, that's not true now, but down through the century they did. And in fact, as recently as the 1940s, the 1930s, Gandhi, a great Indian leader, tried to get his people to dress in that old habit, dress the old way, and he wanted their women to go back to making yarn with spinning, and the spinning wheel was his symbol. He's saying we're going to go back and live the old way, forget about technology, forget about modern things. I will hasten to add, though, the people of India have not followed his advice. India is becoming a technological place. They have computers, they have cell phones, they have, automobiles. But Gandhi was trying to imagine that they could go back and live the old way and get away from the corrupting influence of modern technology. We'll talk about Gandhi second semester. But India's dress styles haven't changed much. That's in the opening vignette. Now, the Silk Road. I have mentioned the Silk Road, and where it's important with India is that the Silk Road started in China, and at various, now sometimes it skipped India. There were times it took this route, but a lot of the time it took this route right here through northern India, and it eventually wound up even taking a route through Arabia. They would choose a route that was less likely to be hit by bandits. And it was a route where they had a strong king who had a strong army and who could keep the bandits in check or make the bandits afraid to come after them. So for a time, the Silk Road went through India, and this facilitated trade. India, your book emphasizes two parts. There's northern India here and southern India. Southern India, of course, didn't have the benefit of the Silk Road, but southern India traded a lot with the Far East and with Africa. But by this time, African trade seems to have fallen off. And a lot of India's trade then was with this part of the world right here, Southeast Asia, which we'll talk about in the next part of the chapter. Now, Indian philosophy is very contradictory. Their philosophers talk about two things: a strong local nobility and a strong king. And folk, you hardly can have both. Either you have a strong king and the nobles are not so strong, or you have a strong nobility. Now, the nobility was important this time because kings had to rule through their nobles. A king could only be one place at a time. Now, fast forward to the 20th century. I've been criticized for doing this, but I think I really need to. Adolf Hitler had the telephone, had the airplane, and had the yellow bill. He didn't have to govern through, well, he did have to have helpers, but all of his helpers would be right there with him in Berlin. He didn't have to scatter his nobles throughout the kingdom. He could govern Germany by means of telephone and telegraph and radio. And he would get on the radio and just speak, and his voice could be heard all the world. A lot of Americans listen to him on shortwave because shortwave would travel across the ocean. But this time period we're talking about in India, kings had to govern through nobles. So they'd appoint a nobleman, you'd be the duke of this. So India wound up with what we call a feudal system. Now, we run to this word feudal 3 times. Once when talking about medieval India, the other time when talking about Japan, which we'll come to later. The word feudal simply means where the nobles can act as independently as they want. They have a king, but he has very little real authority. But you have a king, and under the king, now I'm jumping to European feudal system, which is the feudal system was the biggest one in the world. There's one in Europe. The one in Europe was the biggest in the world. You had a king, and he oftentimes had no power whatsoever to speak of. And under him were the dukes, and they actually were the power, the dukes. And under the dukes were the counts. From the count, the word county, we get the word county. Then under the counts would be various barons and sheriffs, and other lesser officials, viscounts, or whatever. But this feudal system was to govern Europe for almost 1,000 years. In the case of India, they had something like it. They typically, your kings were not strong enough to keep the nobles in check, so the nobles did a lot as they pleased. Now, the Mauryan dynasty faded, and after the Mauryas, the Gupta dynasty took over. And I'll tell you what, don't write down the names Maurya or Gupta. It's not that they're not important, you won't be on the test. And I'm not writing them down. Your book speculates on whether the Gupta dynasty was the new golden age. Your book also talks about the rule of fishes, where the big fish swallowed up the little fish. But India had a whole bunch of people who were called kings, and these kings ruled their domains and would very often fight wars with each other, in spite of the fact that Hinduism called for peace, that there should not be war. But they had a problem with wars anyway. Now, we've run into Buddha and Buddhism before, but at this time period we're talking about the period from about the 300s to the 1400s. During this period, Buddhism rose, particularly when Chandragupta Maurya, the Indian conqueror who conquered most of India, became Buddhist himself. A lot of the Indian kings were Buddhist, and Buddhism almost took over India and became the state religion of India, or the national religion. It didn't.
Yes, sir.
Now, the conflict between Hindu and Buddhist can remind us of conflicts within Christianity, between Catholic and Protestant, between one denomination and another. In the case of Islam, they had to have conflicts, and still do, between Sunni and Shiite, and between other factions within Islam. In the case of India, you might say it was two different denominations, the Hindu on the one hand and the Buddhist on the other. Now, here was a problem with Buddha, for his teachings. Nobody wrote them down for 200 years. Again, in the modern world where we have recordings, we used to record on tape, now we record digitally. They didn't do that then, of course. And you had, after 200 years, there was this group over here who would say, Buddha said this. Over here would be another splinter group, and they'd say, no, Buddha said this. 200 years ago, folks, it was 1815. The Battle of New Orleans had just been fought. Most of you probably don't remember it. James Madison was president. Nobody remembers him. That's a long time. Our country was founded and going. We were on president number 4 at that time. The slavery issue had not yet come to the front and was not yet dividing the country. All this was to come later, but again, that's 200 years long time. Nobody alive today remembers anybody who was alive at that time. Same way with Buddha. After 200 years, nobody knew exactly what he had said, and there was quite a bit of controversy because when they started writing it down, different people would write this, other people would write that. But eventually, though, Buddhism underwent a transformation. All right. I don't know if any of you looked at it. I don't emphasize it anymore, but I do put it on my website. Compare two things: comparative religions and comparative societies, comparative groups. In the case of Buddhism, it has a founder, Buddha. The founder was at first what we would call a sage. Now, I'm not going to write that down. Just to know, a sage is a very wise teacher. Socrates would be considered a sage. They were philosophers. Plato, again, he was a sage. Buddha started out being a sage. Now, some founders are looked on as being sages. Some are looked on as being prophets. A sage is a wise person. I'll repeat that. A prophet is a person who has direct line to God that they serve. Islam believes that Muhammad was a prophet, or the founder can be looked on as being a deity. In the case of Buddha, he went from being a sage to being a deity, where he became looked on as being a god himself, not just a very wise teacher. And when that happened, the concept of nirvana, which Buddha looked on as being somewhat of an abstract concept, not necessarily a real place, where the concept of nirvana became a real place where the good people went when they died. It became like a literal heaven. And then Buddhism went from being a philosophy to being a religion. All this came about. Now, in some ways, though, this was to help lead to the downfall of Buddhism. Now, to make a long story short, folks, Buddhism did not take over India. It started to. For a while, it was the chief religion of India, the chief religion of the educated, the nobles, but it collapsed. Hinduism felt itself threatened, so Hinduism made some changes. One thing, Hinduism said that, well, from here on out, everybody can take part in the rituals rather than just the initiated or the rich. And this made Hinduism more egalitarian. But Hinduism made a few adjustments. They made it easier for perhaps people to think that they were progressing upward. Also, Buddha did not believe in the existence of the soul. The Hindus did. Buddha was egalitarian. And you might think this is great. I mean, for those of you who are American, it might sound great. But the problem was the people of India did not believe in egalitarianism as much as some people do. And the result was the caste system, which Buddha had started to undermine. The caste system wound up taking over. And when it did, Buddhism fell somewhat by the wayside, and Hinduism became dominant. Now, Buddhism continued to spread. Buddhism spread into China and into Korea and Japan. And especially down here, Buddhism wound up becoming the dominant religion of much of this part of the world. Now, it didn't become in China because China has tended to not accept foreign religions. Now, I say that tongue-in-cheek because the year I was born, China embraced communism, which was definitely a foreign religion. But until that time, they would not. And communism has tended to make inroads into this region for a while. In fact, Vietnam went completely communist in 1975. However, Indonesia right here rose up and killed 100,000 communists without any help, by the way, from the United States. And they drove the communists out because they were determined to do so. But these people had a tendency to embrace communism, at least for a time, because maybe communism promised egalitarianism, communism promised utopia, and communism delivered starvation, famine, and more turmoil than it promised, and poverty also. Instead of all of us sharing our wealth, we wind up sharing our poverty. Hey, if any of you disagree, you're welcome to. I can point to the records. I mean, what communism has killed. It killed some 20 million people in Russia when they tried it. Twice a day, Russia, it was then called the Soviet Union. It killed some 25 million in China, all to starvation. I'm talking about starvation. If you haven't read this, you will. But these people would not accept some religions and wound up accepting communism instead. Yes.
So how does that work? I mean, when you adopt communism, the goal would be, right, for less people to starve, obviously. So.
Oh yeah, that's the goal. Here's how it works. It's centrally controlled. Now, in a market economy, supposing that you're a businessman and you find out that this area here is short on bread, well, hey, you rush your trucks there to deliver bread because it's going to put money into your own pockets. But now, supposing you're a central planner and you start planning out, this group gets this much bread. I'm tired, I got to sleep, snooze off and wake up next morning and neglect a certain big segment of your population. I mean, it was a lot of it was sheer bad planning. In the case of both Russia and China, they starved when there was actually food enough to go around. In a market economy, they would all have been fed. under communism, the state would take it, take what they had produced, and not redistribute it back to them. Again, you can't get a central planner to plan the feed. Now, maybe in today's world of computers, you could do it better. I mean, we have computers today. But in those days, they didn't have. Stalin didn't have one. Neither did Mao. And the result was people starved en masse. It's lack of central planning. I mean, lack of adequate central planning. All right. Anyway, Buddhism took a back seat in India. Hinduism came to the front. Your book asks the question, when did the Indians become Hindus? And to make a long story short, the answer is it was a long, gradual process. You can't put an exact date on it. But it did happen. And eventually Hinduism arrived. And Hinduism was already there, but it nosed out Buddhism with a long, slow process as more and more people began to embrace Hinduism and leave Buddhism behind. But then came another religion over the horizon they hadn't expected, Islam. Islam burst out of Arabia, conquered Persia, conquered Afghanistan, and went into here in what was then considered part of India, what we today call Pakistan. And they took over what is today Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh. This on this old map, it's called Pakistan here, but they took over these regions here. And they were helped by several factors. Number one, they caught India in a state of turmoil and disunity and unable to mount a good response. And number two, they came on horseback. And again, if you ever watched any movies about Muslim fighters at this time, they really loved their mounted cavalry, and they'd take their curved swords, most of them ran, hold their curved sword in hand, and they'd swoop down on the enemy army. This was great in the open desert. Again, it would not work in a place like the jungles of Vietnam, and it didn't work very well here, but they swooped in at this area here that's a little bit less fertile. And again, they took over much of India that lacked trees, lacked a lot of fertile land. They did not make a lot of headway down here. Again, that's part of one of the weaknesses of the Islamic way of fighting. They have not done well in fertile green areas, or mountainous areas for that matter either. But also, the Indian army at this time was still using elephants. Now you might notice, hey, the elephant is much bigger than a horse. Yes, but you get an army of horsemen fighting against an army of elephants. Believe it or not, the horsemen are usually likely to win. For one thing, if the horsemen see that they're too greatly outnumbered, all they have to do is run off. The elephant men, on the other hand, they can't run because the horses are faster, so they have to fight whether they want to or not. Speed is often determining the outcome of the battle. Also, horses are more maneuverable, more flexible, and a man on a horseback can reach down and fight a person on the ground. A man in an elephant high up can't do that. And of course, if a man falls off the back of an elephant, it means certain death. A lot of times a man will survive and fall off a horse. So eventually now, the people of India stopped using elephants and went on fighting with on horseback themselves. And when they did, they were able to mount an effective stop against the Islamic advance. But another reason now that Islam did not take over all of India, Genghis Khan came from this region of the world. Now, I've mentioned Genghis Khan already. Genghis Khan came in and he almost wiped Islam off the face of the earth. He and his Mongolians, and they fought the same way that the Islamic people had, but they were better at it. Genghis Khan organized his people into squads of 10 and said anyone who leaves a squad of 10 will be killed. So if you were in a battle, you had to know you fought as a squad. You never fought individually. So if somebody took on a member of your squad, the other 9 men in the squad were expected to rush after him, but they fought as a team. Much more so than the Islamic people did. And anyway, Genghis Khan went through and wiped out a lot of the Islamic territory. Then a couple of generations later, I've got to write this thing down. Tamerlane. Hi. In some ways, Tamerlane was worse than Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan was a killer. He enjoyed killing. He loved it. Tamerlane, Genghis Khan killed at least to open trade routes to enrich himself. Tamerlane killed just for the pure joy of killing. And when he'd come to a place, he would simply destroy their government, but he would not put a government in its place. And that's why after he died, almost everything he conquered fell apart. And on his deathbed, he got his sons around. Sons, don't start bullying on yourself. Don't start infighting. I've appointed the one who wants to succeed me, but his advice fell on deaf ears. His sons started fighting hard among themselves. Nevertheless, Tamerlane now was a Muslim, but he treated Muslims worse than he treated anybody else he conquered. He went into Muslim territories, destroyed their governments, killed all the top officials, burnt cities to the ground, and a lot of the cities he destroyed had never been rebuilt. He didn't bother the people of India so much. What he did was he got these Muslims to fighting among themselves, and the result was India had a period of respite, where India could then reorganize its armies. Its kings could somewhat quit their quarreling, at least long enough to fight Islam. Bottom line was, Islam never got deep into India. They got on the edge, the fringe, got all around it, the outer areas, but did not penetrate into southern India. Again, now, this was to go on for a couple hundred years. Tamerlane lived in the 1300s, but then came a new threat to India. In 1498, and I am going to ask you to remember that date, but not now. It won't be on the next test. Actually, it will be in the second semester. Don't worry about it. 6 years after Christopher Columbus, had Portuguese sailors sailed all the way around Africa and landed in India. By the time he got to India, I mean, his crew were dirty and ragged. His ship was dirty with the sails all torn and tattered and planks rotting. He had to do some repair work on his ship. But he got to India. He was welcomed in India. Oh, yeah, finally, someone's come here from Europe, got all the way around Africa. How great. It wasn't so great for India in the long run. They went back and they got other Europeans to follow. Portugal was too small to conquer India, but eventually the British came. Now, folk, I hope all of you know that Great Britain once lost 13 colonies in North America. Hopefully all of you know what I'm talking about. Georgia, by the way, was one of the colonies. When Britain lost its 13 North American colonies, they said, well, now we've got to get some of our money back, what we lost. So they decided to go in and conquer India. So they went all the way around, and General Cornwallis, who had surrendered at Yorktown, it was the last battle of the war, they gave the Americans their independence. General Cornwallis, once he got back to Britain, the people of Britain said, well, you can redeem yourself, go around Africa, go to India. Cornwallis is one of the men who helped conquer India. The British conquered India, but that's a subject for second semester world history, what the British did in India. The British would hold India for about 150 years. All right. Anyway, between the British, now, what effect did these outsiders have on India? Now, the people of India had some practices that simply would not cut it in the modern world. Of course, let's face it, everybody does. One of their practices was that, of course, that certain people were outcasts and they would be considered trash and they would do the menial jobs and they could never rise above that. This was frowned on by the outside world, to say the least, most of the outside world. Also, the people of India would allow their own people to starve while the cattle throve and got fat because they would not eat beef, would not eat cows. Again, this brought them into conflict with the outside world. Hey, why don't you just eat your cows and you'll all be well fed and poverty will come to an end, and all. They couldn't do that. They would sometimes have 9-year-old girls getting married, and then another practice was when the wife died, they would build a fire, and the wife was expected to throw herself on a fire and kill herself. And a practice called jizya, I believe, but maybe I mixed it. Anyway, it was a practice where the wife would just throw herself on a fire and kill herself. Now, folk, now think about it. A 9-year-old girl marries a 30-year-old man, or a 35 or 40-year-old man. Which one of them is likely to die first? The old man is likely to die first. And the young woman then is left a widow. Their children didn't want to take care of it. Rather than have these widows become so burdensome, let's just kill the widows off. Well, this practice now, when it came into conflict with the world also. Now, when Britain conquered India, they had to deal with this. As for the Muslims, they didn't seem to care. They let Indians go on with more. The fact that Islam had very little impact on India, except that Indian men saw that Muslim men, Hindu men, saw that Muslim men would seclude their wives. So a lot of Hindu men began to do the same thing. They figured they just to keep the wife at home and maybe help keep her faithful. So they would seclude your wives. Let me hasten to say, I do not believe in any of this at all. I mean, I'm married myself, and my wife has a car at home, and she can go out anytime she chooses, and often does. Again, hopefully I'm not so insecure that I feel like, no, I got to keep her at home, and I'll let her outside my sight. Who knows, she might run around, or hey. No, but these people were very insecure, and they still are, afraid that their wives are going to run around if they turn them loose in at least a little bit, and probably they would be. I mean, when they're clamped down that tightly, they just might decide to run around. But, nevertheless, Indian men copied the fact. Now, there is another practice. Muslims do eat beef, Hindus do not, and this led to a lot of conflict. But neither one of them eat pork. Neither the Hindus nor Muslims eat pork. But Muslims do eat beef. So there was a lot of conflict went on. And folk, the conflict has been going on for 1,000 years. It was around the year 1000 that the Muslims first came in, and the two sides still don't get along. They have fought a war in modern times. Both sides today have developed the atomic bomb without the rest of the world's approval, but both sides have it. And that's interesting because there are stories that atomic weapons were exploded right here in present-day Pakistan 3,800 years ago, 3,800 years ago. There are persons who strongly believe it. All right. Again, I'm looking at page 251. Muslim rule, all in all, probably did not have a significant impact on India. All right, now on a personal note, when I was working at Lockheed was in the habit of hiring people from this part of the world, people who were from countries that would buy our airplanes. So we'd hire Koreans, we'd hire Japanese, hoping they'd buy our planes. And in my department one time, they brought in a man from Pakistan and a man from India. The Pakistani man was Muslim, the Indian man was Hindu, and they hated each other first, but then they realized that here in America, they were more alike than either one of them was like Americans, so they wound up becoming hard friends, even to the point that meet after work and sit down at a restaurant and eat together. One of them would tolerate the other one's eating practices. I mean, yes, neither one of them would eat pork, but one of them did eat beef, which the other one considered to be anathema. But nevertheless, they wound up overlooking their differences, got along. The one from Pakistan, as far as I know, he's still at Lockheed. He's now risen to the rank of supervisor. The one from India only lived about 51 years and developed throat cancer, and it took him out. But amazing little story there. We watched it. At first, the two men carried their own prejudice with them from their countries, and then wound up realizing they were more alike than they realized. All right. Again, a lot of women did not improve. It was to be left to the British to change some of the Hindu practices of women throwing themselves on fire when husbands die, or shallow marriages, and these were awkward problems for the people of India to deal with. Once they called them Christian, the civilized, the outside world said, now wait, you've got to change these people you conquer. That's what conquerors do. You've got to change them, and some of this stuff that they do is wrong. And the British thought, oh my God. it's awkward. I mean, dealing with problems like that when you're an outsider. But eventually, now, I say the people of India are starting to come around to the modern world, but there was a case that occurred about 6 or 7 years ago where a Hindu man killed his daughter because she dated a man who was of a different caste. What's so different about that, you might ask? Simply this crime, and I'm going to call it a crime, occurred right here in the United States. When taken to the judge, I mean, because this is a crime, I mean, to kill anyone, any human being, the man, well, this is my religion, and I thought I had a right to free religion here in this country. The judge said, no, we do not allow this practice here in this country. In this country, this is a crime. And the judge sent the man to prison for not a big sentence, but a small sentence. The man believed that he had the right to kill his daughter for the crime of dating someone with another. Now, again, you talk to a Hindu person today, they'll say, oh, we don't do that anymore. Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. I've gotten close to some of them, and there are cases where you cannot marry out of your caste without running a risk of being ostracized or worse by your family. The outcasts, they have tried to bring them up into society and mix them in, the pariahs, with perhaps some success. All right. The one thing I remember about economy was mostly it consists of agriculture. Most of the people made a living, even the nobles, by agriculture. The nobles, of course, made a living by having big farms and farming them out. Cattle was not allowed to be eaten, but cattle did. They were put to work. The cows were put to work in pulling the pulling the carts, pulling the plows. So they did make their cattle work for them, but they would not eat their cattle. Trade, eventually most of their trade went to this region right here, and India had a strong influence on Southeast Asia we'll talk about in a minute or two. All right. Your book goes on to talk more about Indian art, and I have to pass over it, and here's one quote. I have to confess to you. My daughter is majoring in art. I know nothing about Indian art to speak of, so I'll pass over that part of it. And nothing about it beyond. It's important, folks. The art that any society has is important. It's not that I'm belittling it. I mean, I did talk to you about Greek art and even Roman art, Western art perhaps, but when it comes to India, I simply have to confess to you I know nothing. All right, we'll move on. Southeast Asia.
No music there.
Music, regrettably, I know practically nothing about Indian music. Seem like they do a lot of singing, and I've heard Indian people sing their religious songs. But as far as you able to describe it regrettably, I simply can't teach it because I never learned it. I want to say this, folks. Indian history was not taught to me during the 12 years I went to elementary and high school, 4 years of college, and 2 years of graduate school. I never encountered it. So I've had to learn it myself as I go. Same way the history of Southeast Asia. It is important. And I'm glad I've had to learn it because I feel like I know more about the world, having studied at least the basics of Indian society, Indian religion, Indian philosophy, who they intermingled with, and some of the things that went on. And regrettably, though the other stuff about art and music, I simply have not learned. All right, Southeast Asia. Until the United States passed them up, Southeast Asia was more of a melting pot than any other place in the world. Its people were very diverse. They got people coming into them from Japan, from Korea, from Mongolia, from China, from India, and likely from Africa. And all these people mixed in, and we find out after a while that it looks like there's a language group here, and then the same language group might be found here, and the same language group might be found here. The fact is, these people sometimes just splinter off and leave their tribes behind and move to a location thousands of miles away. and start a new life, but still speaking the same language. We try to match up their DNA as a hodgepodge, a soup, you might say. DNA of one kind right here, next door might be a DNA of another kind, and then the next door after that, a DNA of another kind, a hodgepodge. These people, though, unlike the United States, were never able to unite. Now, an exception, Indonesia eventually united. But, folk, I doubt that any conqueror could have united them. Alexander the Great, I mean, all right, to unite them, you had to have been able to have a man who could fight sea battles. I mean, after all, this area is separated from each other by large bodies of water. You know, there's many islands. And then on the land, there's a lot of mountains. This is a mountainous area. This is mountainous. This is mountainous. And also, jungle separates these people. The jungle, again, gets so thick you cannot cross it. And we're finally, if you keep up with botany and zoology, we're discovering a whole lot of new species of plants and animals every year. I'm talking about new species of amphibians, reptiles, as we go into the jungle and find species. Some of them we've had seen their bones already and thought they've been dead for a million years. We're finding out they're very much alive and very much in existence. Others of them we just simply have a hard time classifying because they're like nothing you've seen before. And we just simply don't know what class, so we wind up sometimes putting them in a class themselves. But we're finding more reptiles, more amphibians, and more different kinds of plant life. And, oh yeah, invertebrate life also, millipedes, centipedes, we did not know existed. We're finding in this region of the world right here. Again, they were separated by jungles, mountains, oceans, and again, Alexander the Great could hardly have united them because he was not a seaman, and I can't imagine Alexander getting on board a ship and trying to cross and fight a sea battle. I mean, he just simply did not encounter the oceans that much. And the same way with Genghis Khan. I mean, Genghis Khan was a fighter from horseback. What would he have done on this fighting a sea battle? Well, folk, I don't know if he could have managed. So these people, to make a long story short, they did not easily unite. Now, eventually, these islands here united, these islands here united and stayed so. Then these islands united, but as far as uniting the whole area, that has not been done. Southeast Asia is known for copying a lot of what it saw in China. They've been strongly influenced by China and by India. From India, they got their religion, which is mostly Buddhism and Hinduism. From China, they got their ability to grow rice. And a lot of these people in this part of the world grow rice, again, having been taught that by the Chinese up here. Originally, these people appear to have moved into this region because they wanted to get away from civilization. Did not know that civilization would tend to follow them where they went, so they would, hey, the people of my generation did it too. The hippies would try to drop out of society. We're going to not worry about money, not worry about income, all this material thing. We're going to seek to fulfill ourselves spiritually. Well, these people would break away from other regions of the world and come here, hoping a lot of times to get away from it all. But sometimes they realized that being uncivilized was not the way to go, so they built up big cities and civilizations also. And they fought wars like everybody else. They traded. One of the biggest things they traded, in addition to rice, was various kinds of spices. Their spices became the envy of China, and their spices eventually found their way to Europe and to North and South America. Paddy fields and spices. I'm looking at the bottom of page 259. Now, eventually, some of these islands off the Indonesian archipelago, and it is kind of we call it archipelago because it extends way out. Peninsula is another word for it, but it extends way out from the mainland. But eventually, some conqueror was able to unite these islands, but all this did was make it easier for the Dutch. The Dutch came in from Europe, and the Dutch was to wind up conquering, holding Indonesia for hundreds of years. The Spanish conquered the Philippines until the United States took it from them in 1898. Then the United States gave it back. But these regions wound up being conquered. The French conquered Vietnam for a long time, and in fact, the French conquered a lot of this region here, and they called it French Indochina. All that is jumping a little bit ahead of the story a bit. Britain conquered India, and Britain conquered some of this region here. Europeans eventually took over and stayed for a few hundred years and made their weight felt, to say the least, before leaving. Now, one place I must mention, Angkor. Angkor is a large, large city deep in a jungle. What is today Cambodia? When Europeans first went there, some of the natives spread rumors about, oh, deep in the jungle, there's a big, big city. But no European really believed them. I mean, these people can't build big cities. Then one day, some European explorer was roaming through the jungle, and all of a sudden the jungle burst open into a big clearing. And there in front of him was one of the biggest cities he had seen, uninhabited. A 6-foot black snake stood across his path. He ignored it and ignored him. A tiger peeked out from one of the windows of one of the buildings. I mean, this window was open, no glass. He ignored the tiger, and the tiger ignored him. Make a long story short, he went back and told other Europeans what he'd seen. They went to the place, and they found this abandoned city, of which there are pictures of it on page 266. You would not realize that Angkor is actually in the middle of the jungle here, because the jungle was cleared away. But when the Europeans found it, the city had not been lived in for 400 years. Well, the Europeans began to inquire, archaeologists, historians began to inquire, when did this city, when was it built, how big was it, how many people lived in it, and eventually pieced together the story. As has happened so many times, Angkor was beset by uncivilized people living around it. The uncivilized got the upper hand, and finally the people in Angkor simply abandoned it. Most of them went off and built the city of Phnom Penh, which is on the river. But Phnom Penh never got the magnificence and splendor that Angkor had. Now, I first became aware of Angkor Wat when I was at Lockheed, and again, I keep referring to that time, but I spent 27 years there, and somebody handed me a National Geographic that was devoted to Angkor Wat. Angkor, yeah, Wat, it's sometimes called Angkor, sometimes Angkor Wat. And they said that Angkor was a thriving place, well, that was obvious, until, now folks, this is something I've never read since, because, well, I don't know why, maybe we've abandoned that idea. But they said Angkor was a thriving place as long as its kings were Hindu. Its Hindu kings were energetic, thriving, go out and get them, conquering, trading, building up industry, building projects. Then their kings converted to Buddhism, and Buddhism emphasized accept what is, whatever will be, and there's nothing you can do about it, accept it always the will of the divine, and spend your time in contemplative meditation. And the result was the outsiders began to see that, hey, these people are not as industrious as they were, they're not as energetic, they don't have the fighting zeal they once did. So their uncivilized neighbors began to move in. And eventually they forced these civilized people in Angkor Wat to move out. Again, folks, this has happened throughout history time and time and time again. There's a whole lot of abandoned cities. And just the other day I heard one, the sunken city, not sunk under water, but sunk under earth, being found, being discovered. They're being discovered all the time, and have been all of my lifetime. Some new city that we'd heard rumors about. One of the more famous being the city of Ebla, located along here. Ebla, we heard it existed, and one day we found it and dug it up. I've done some studying on Ebla. Angkor Wat, same thing. Anyway, these people one time had civilizations. A point I want to make, folks. When these people, once they started out, they generally started out as worshiping nature spirits or animistic. Animism that often involves shamanism. nature worship or spirit worship. And then when they became civilized, now, I mean, animism is generally religion for the primitive people. When they became civilized, they adopted, the more civilized among them were, they adopted the religion of India, either Hinduism or Buddhism. And this helped them, you might say, to civilize somewhat. But a lot of times they eventually went back to old tribal ways. The tribal peoples we find throughout the world are descended from people who were once much more advanced. And this is true whether it be North American Indian, African, Far Eastern, Asian. They were not primitive peoples rising up. They were advanced peoples who had fallen down. And this is something that I want to emphasize. I mean, hey, folks, evolution says man rose. The records seem to show that man fell. You can believe what you want to. This is the one class I teach where I don't talk about evolution. I don't have enough time, but I could if I wanted to. But these people descended, I mean the primitive descended from more advanced peoples. And you just look on page 266, you'll see the famous Great Heads of Easter Island, which we believe were built by the people who once lived on Easter Island. But the natives we found living there, folk could not have built them. I think their ancestors had, because their ancestors were advanced and had the ability. But these heads are tremendous, very large. And what purpose do they serve? Again, I'm not going to speculate. I have read about them. If you read conspiracy books, Easter Island fits into thinking of a lot of conspiracy theorists. You can laugh if you want to, but there are fringe areas, folk, in our knowledge, that simply, things that simply cannot be explained within the context of modern scholarship. All right, I have to leave you there. I mean,